Subscribe to Storylab for more stories. Now let's begin this one. Chapter 1. The Golden Years. Phil Powers adjusted his Italian silk tie as he gazed out the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office on the 42nd floor. The city sprawled beneath him like a conquered kingdom, and in many ways it was. At 38, he had built the marketing division of Meridian Industries into the company's most profitable arm, generating over $200 million in annual revenue. The irony wasn't lost on him that his greatest professional triumph had also been his greatest personal mistake. 12 years ago, fresh out of Harvard Business School with an MBA and burning ambition, Phil had joined Meridian as a junior analyst. The company, founded by the enigmatic billionaire Charles McCormick, had been struggling to modernize its image. Phil's innovative digital marketing strategies had not only saved the company, but transformed it into a tech industry leader. It was during those early, grueling 18-hour days that he'd met Valerie Matthews, then a sharp-tongued corporate lawyer handling Meridian's acquisitions. She was beautiful in that predatory way that should have served as a warning. Platinum blonde hair always perfectly styled, green eyes that could freeze or seduce depending on her needs, and a smile that never quite reached her eyes when she thought no one was looking. Their courtship had been a whirlwind of power lunches and late-night strategy sessions. Phil, drunk on success and infatuation, had mistaken her calculated charm for genuine affection. They married within a year, and for a while, they were the golden couple of corporate America. Phil's marketing genius combined with Valerie's legal acumen made them unstoppable. She climbed the corporate ladder with ruthless efficiency, eventually becoming chief legal officer, while Phil expanded his division internationally. Their daughter Lindsay was born 3 years into their marriage, a beautiful child with Phil's dark hair and her mother's piercing green eyes. For a brief moment, Phil thought he had everything: power, wealth, a beautiful family, and a future that seemed limitless. But success, Phil learned, was a cruel teacher. It revealed character rather than building it. The first cracks appeared when Lindsay turned 5. Valerie's late nights at the office became more frequent, her explanations more elaborate. Phil, consumed with expanding into Asian markets, chose to ignore the obvious signs. Trust, he discovered, was just another currency he'd overvalued. The company Christmas party had been their last public appearance as a couple. Phil remembered watching Valerie work the room, her hand occasionally brushing against Mario Hunter's arm as they discussed legal strategies. Mario, the newly appointed VP of Operations, was everything Phil wasn't: tall, silver-haired, with the kind of effortless charm that came from old money and older connections. He joined Meridian 6 months earlier, bringing with him a pedigree from Goldman Sachs and a reputation for turning companies around. Phil had built his success through intelligence, innovation, and sheer force of will. Mario Hunter had been born into his. "Daddy, are you coming to my recital tomorrow?" Lindsay's voice had cut through his memories that night as she tugged on his tuxedo jacket. "Of course, sweetheart," he'd replied, lifting her into his arms. Over her shoulder, he'd caught Valerie and Mario exchanging a look that lasted exactly 3 seconds too long. That look had cost them everything. Chapter 2. The Unraveling. The truth came to Phil not in a dramatic confrontation, but in a manila folder left on his desk by his secretary, Neil Irwin, a quiet man whose loyalty Phil had earned through years of fair treatment and generous bonuses. Inside were photographs, phone records, hotel receipts, and credit card statements. A paper trail of betrayal so meticulously documented it could have been used as evidence in court. Phil spent 3 hours in his locked office studying the materials. Valerie and Mario had been conducting their affair for 8 months, using company resources to fund their trysts. Worse, they'd been systematically positioning themselves to consolidate power within Meridian. Mario's restructuring recommendations weren't just about efficiency. They were about eliminating anyone who might oppose their eventual takeover. The most damning evidence was a series of text messages between Valerie and Mario discussing Phil's usefulness and when it might be time to transition leadership. They spoke about him like a corporate asset to be liquidated when convenient. Phil's hands had remained steady as he read, but something fundamental shifted inside him that day. The last vestiges of the man who believed in fairness, who thought people were essentially good, who trusted that hard work and loyalty mattered. That man died in his corner office on a Tuesday afternoon in October. The confrontation that evening had been almost anticlimactic. Phil had waited until Lindsay was asleep before laying the evidence on the kitchen island where Valerie was reviewing contracts. "I want a divorce," he'd said simply. Valerie's face had gone through a fascinating progression of emotions: surprise, calculation, defiance, and finally, cold resolve. "I suppose you think you're entitled to half of everything." "I'm entitled to nothing," Phil had replied. "And I'm taking exactly what I deserve." The divorce proceedings had been vicious. Valerie, backed by Mario's resources and connections, had assembled a legal team that attacked Phil from every angle. They challenged his contribution to their shared assets, questioned his fitness as a father, and launched a whisper campaign throughout the industry about his unstable behavior and inability to handle pressure. Phil had fought back with clinical precision. He protected his intellectual property, secured his patents, and documented every instance of Valerie's affair being conducted on company time and resources. But corporate politics were different from corporate law. While Phil won the legal battles, Valerie and Mario were winning the war for control of Meridian. Charles McCormick, the company's reclusive founder, had remained conspicuously absent during the entire ordeal. Rumors suggested he was in poor health, possibly suffering from early-stage dementia. The board of directors, many of whom had been handpicked by Mario's contacts in the financial world, began questioning Phil's leadership of the marketing division. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Mario Hunter was promoted to COO. 3 months later, Valerie was named CEO during a board meeting Phil wasn't invited to attend. Her first act was to announce a comprehensive restructuring of the company's operations. Phil had seen it coming, but the public humiliation at the annual company auction still took his breath away. Chapter 3. The Auction. The Meridian Industries annual charity auction was typically a stuffy affair held in the company's main conference hall, with middle management bidding on vacation packages and restaurant gift certificates while executives made appropriate charitable gestures for tax purposes. This year, however, Valerie had transformed it into something far more theatrical. The hall had been redesigned with a proper auction stage, professional lighting, and seating for over 300 employees. Phil sat in the middle section with his department, watching Valerie command the stage in a red power dress that cost more than most people's monthly salary. Mario stood beside her, playing the role of supportive partner with nauseating perfection. Lindsay, now 11 and old enough to understand the tension between her parents, sat rigidly beside Phil. She'd insisted on attending, despite Phil's attempts to spare her the inevitable awkwardness. At 11, she was already showing signs of her mother's sharp intelligence and her father's stubborn determination. "Ladies and gentlemen," Valerie's voice carried perfectly through the sound system. "Before we begin tonight's auction, I have a special announcement regarding the future direction of our company." Phil felt the familiar tightness in his chest that preceded bad news. "As we continue to streamline our operations and focus on core competencies, we'll be discontinuing several legacy departments that no longer align with our strategic vision." Valerie's eyes found Phil in the crowd, and her smile grew sharper. "Including our domestic marketing division." The room fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning. Phil's department, 15 people who had helped build Meridian's success, stared at the stage in shock. But rather than simply announce layoffs, Valerie continued, her voice taking on a playful tone that made Phil's skin crawl. "I thought we'd do something more interactive." She gestured to the side of the stage, where 2 security guards appeared. "Mr. Phil Powers, would you please join me on stage? And bring Lindsay with you." Phil's blood turned to ice. Using Lindsay as a prop was crossing a line he hadn't imagined even Valerie would breach. But refusing would only make the spectacle worse. He took his daughter's hand and walked to the stage, feeling 300 pairs of eyes tracking his movement. "You see," Valerie said, wrapping her arm around Lindsay's shoulders in a gesture that looked maternal but felt possessive, "Phil here represents everything that's held this company back. Outdated thinking, resistance to change, loyalty to obsolete methods." Lindsay's face was pale, but she stood straight, her green eyes blazing with an anger that reminded Phil painfully of himself. "So, I thought," Valerie continued, "why don't we auction off his loyalty? After all, he's always claimed it was worth so much. Let's see what the market thinks." The crowd was dead silent now, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented and possibly career-ending for anyone who reacted incorrectly. "Do I hear $1 for Phil Powers' unwavering loyalty to this company?" Valerie called out, her voice dripping with mock enthusiasm. The silence stretched until Mario Hunter, playing his role to perfection, shouted from the side of the stage, "Too much." The cruel laughter that rippled through parts of the audience was the moment Phil Powers, the man who believed in fairness and playing by the rules, died completely. Lindsay began to sob beside him, and Phil felt something dark and cold settle into the space where his heart used to be. But then, from the back of the room, a voice cut through the toxic atmosphere like a blade. "I'll bid 10 million. Every head turned to see a figure standing in the shadows near the rear exit. Charles McCormick, founder of Meridian Industries, stepped into the light. At 78, he was smaller than his reputation suggested, but his presence filled the room with an authority that made Valerie's performance seem suddenly petty and amateurish. On the condition, McCormick continued, his voice carrying easily without amplification, that he replaces you as CEO. The silence that followed was so complete that Phil could hear his own heartbeat. Valerie's face cycled through confusion, panic, and rage before settling on cold calculation. "Charles," she said, her voice carefully controlled, "I think there might be some confusion." "No confusion at all," McCormick interrupted. "The board will be meeting tomorrow morning at 9. I suggest you bring your resignation letter." He turned to Phil, and for a moment, their eyes met across the room. Something passed between them, an understanding, a recognition, perhaps even a warning. "Mr. Powers," McCormick said, "I believe we have some catching up to do." Then he was gone, leaving behind a room full of people trying to process what they'd just witnessed. Phil looked down at Lindsay, whose tears had stopped. She was staring at the spot where McCormick had stood with an expression he'd never seen on her young face before. It was the look of someone learning that the world was far more complicated and dangerous than she'd ever imagined. As they left the stage, Phil caught Valerie's eye one last time. The mask had slipped completely now, and he saw something there that made his blood run cold. This wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. Chapter 4. The Founder's Gambit. Charles McCormick's estate sat on 47 acres of prime Connecticut real estate, hidden behind stone walls and security gates that spoke of serious money and serious privacy concerns. Phil had driven through these gates once before, 12 years ago, when he'd first joined Meridian as a junior analyst. Back then, he'd been awed by the old money elegance of the Tudor mansion and its perfectly manicured grounds. Now, sitting in the same library where McCormick had first outlined his vision for Meridian's future, Phil saw things differently. The leather-bound books weren't just decoration. They were reference materials. The artwork wasn't just expensive. It was strategic, chosen to project specific messages about power, culture, and legacy. Even McCormick himself seemed different, more alert and calculating than the frail, possibly senile old man the rumors suggested. "You're wondering why I waited so long to act," McCormick said, pouring himself a glass of 25-year-old scotch. Phil had declined the offer. He needed clarity, not comfort. "Among other things," Phil replied. McCormick settled into the leather armchair across from Phil, and for a moment, he looked every one of his 78 years. Building a company is like raising a child. Sometimes you need to let them make their own mistakes before they'll listen to wisdom. And Valerie's coup was a mistake you needed Meridian to make? Valerie's coup was inevitable the moment I allowed Mario Hunter into the building. McCormick's eyes hardened. "I've been watching him for years, Phil. He's a corporate sociopath with a gift for identifying and exploiting weakness. The question was never whether he'd make a play for control, but when." Phil leaned forward. "You knew about the affair?" "I knew about the affair before your ex-wife did." McCormick took a sip of his scotch. "Mario's method is always the same. Identify the key power structure in an organization, find the person closest to real authority, seduce them, literally or figuratively, and use them as a weapon against anyone who might oppose him. Phil felt the familiar anger building, but this time it was different. Colder, more focused. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to understand what you're really facing," McCormick said. "Mario Hunter isn't just some ambitious executive having an affair with your ex-wife. He's part of a larger network, corporate raiders who specialize in hostile takeovers of family-owned businesses. Meridian isn't his first target, and it won't be his last." McCormick stood and walked to a wall-mounted display case filled with corporate documents and photographs. He pulled out a thick folder and handed it to Phil. "Hunter's real name is Mario Castellanos. He's the son of a cartel money launderer who went legitimate in the 1980s by buying distressed companies, stripping their assets, and selling the pieces. Mario refined the technique. Instead of hostile takeovers, he infiltrates from within." Phil opened the folder and found himself looking at a corporate family tree that stretched back 15 years. Company after company, all following the same pattern: a mysterious financial crisis, a charismatic new executive brought in to restructure, key personnel eliminated or marginalized, and finally, the company sold to overseas investors for a fraction of its actual value. "He's done this 17 times, McCormick continued. "The companies are always profitable, always family-owned or closely held, and always have something his network wants: patents, real estate, market position, or customer data." Phil looked up from the documents. "What does Meridian have that they want?" McCormick smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. "Everything, son. We have everything." Over the next 2 hours, McCormick laid out the scope of what Phil was facing. Meridian Industries wasn't just a marketing and tech company. It was the parent corporation for a network of subsidiaries that controlled supply chains, manufacturing facilities, and distribution networks across 3 continents. The company held patents on technologies that wouldn't be commercially viable for another decade, owned real estate in major cities around the world, and maintained exclusive contracts with governments and multinational corporations. The publicly reported value of Meridian is roughly $800 million, McCormick explained. The actual value, including intellectual property, real estate, and strategic partnerships, is closer to $12 billion. Phil set down the documents he'd been reading. "And Mario plans to steal all of it. Mario plans to acquire it legally through market manipulation, strategic bankruptcies, and forced sales. By the time he's finished, Meridian will be owned by a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands, and its assets will be distributed among his network's other holdings." "How long do we have?" McCormick checked his watch. "Based on previous patterns, 18 months. Maybe less." Phil stood and walked to the window overlooking McCormick's estate. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the manicured lawn. In the distance, he could see Lindsay playing with McCormick's dogs, massive German shepherds that had somehow taken an immediate liking to her. "Why me?" Phil asked. "You could hire any number of corporate security firms, private investigators, or lawyers to handle this. Because they would approach this as a business problem," McCormick replied. "You're going to approach it as a war." Phil turned back to face the old man. "You think I want revenge?" "I think you want justice," McCormick corrected. "And I think you're finally angry enough to do what's necessary to get it." McCormick was right, and they both knew it. The humiliation at the auction had been the final straw, but the betrayal had been building for months. Phil had played by the rules, fought fair, and lost everything. Mario and Valerie had cheated, lied, and manipulated their way to power, and they were about to be rewarded with billions of dollars. "What's the plan?" Phil asked. McCormick's smile returned, and this time it was genuinely pleased. "The plan, my boy, is to give them exactly what they want, and then watch them choke on it." Chapter 5: Building the Arsenal. Phil's new office occupied the entire 54th floor of the McCormick Building, a gleaming tower in Manhattan's financial district that housed the private investment arm of Charles McCormick's empire. The view was spectacular, the resources unlimited, and the mission clear: destroy Mario Hunter and Valerie Powers before they could complete their theft of Meridian Industries. The official story was that Phil had been hired as a senior consultant for McCormick Holdings, tasked with evaluating potential acquisition targets. The reality was far more complex and infinitely more dangerous. In the 3 weeks since the auction, Phil had assembled a team that looked like a corporate hit squad. His second in command was Tomas Holcomb, a former Navy SEAL turned corporate security specialist who had spent the last decade protecting executives from kidnapping, blackmail, and assassination attempts. Holcomb's expertise in surveillance, counterintelligence, and what he euphemistically called persuasion techniques made him invaluable for the kind of war they were preparing to fight. Brad Orr handled the financial warfare. A former SEC investigator who had been forced out for being too aggressive in pursuing white-collar criminals, or had an encyclopedic knowledge of securities law, tax codes, and the kind of financial instruments that could be weaponized against corporate raiders. His specialty was creating legal traps that looked like legitimate business opportunities until it was too late to escape. The team's technical specialist was Alberta Rhodes, a forensic accountant and data analyst who could trace money through the most complex corporate structures and find patterns in financial data that revealed criminal conspiracies. Her ability to turn numbers into narratives had helped convict dozens of corporate criminals, and now she was using those skills to map Mario's network and identify their vulnerabilities. Phil's days began at 5 in the morning with intelligence briefings from Holcomb and ended near midnight with strategy sessions that felt more like military planning than business meetings. The war room on the 53rd floor was lined with whiteboards covered in organizational charts, financial flowcharts, and timelines that track Mario's previous operations with forensic precision. "He's accelerating the timeline," Alberta reported during their morning briefing. Meridian's quarterly earnings report showed a 15% decline in revenue, despite our knowing that actual sales increased by 8%. Phil studied the financial data on the wall-mounted display. "He's manipulating the books to justify emergency measures." More than that, Brad added, "He's creating artificial crises that require immediate solutions. Emergency board meetings, rushed decisions, desperate measures that just happen to benefit his network's interests." Holcomb pulled up a surveillance photo on the main screen. It showed Mario and Valerie having dinner at an exclusive Manhattan restaurant with 3 men Phil didn't recognize. The tall one is Gustavo Mendoza, senior partner at Goldman Sachs and Mario's primary financial backer, Holcomb explained. The one with the scar is Pedro Gross, a specialist in corporate acquisitions who handles the legal framework for hostile takeovers. The third man is Timothy Cowan, and he's the reason we need to be very careful about how we proceed. Phil studied the photograph. Cowan looked ordinary, middle-aged, slightly overweight, the kind of person who would disappear in any crowd. What makes him dangerous? Cowan specializes in making problems disappear, Holcomb said. Corporate whistleblowers who suffer accidents, investigators who suddenly find themselves under investigation, executives who decide to retire early for health reasons. He's connected to at least 6 suspicious deaths over the past decade, but nothing that could ever be proven in court. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. This wasn't just corporate warfare. It was a battle against people who were willing to kill to protect their interests. Phil's phone buzzed with a text message from Lindsay. "Dad, something weird happened at school today. Can we talk?" "We'll continue this later," Phil said, grabbing his jacket. Family emergency. Phil found Lindsay waiting for him in the lobby of her exclusive private school, her backpack clutched tightly against her chest and her green eyes scanning the crowd nervously. At 11, she was already showing signs of inheriting both her parents' intelligence and their paranoid streak. "What happened?" Phil asked as they walked to his car. "Mom came to school today," Lindsay said. "She wanted to take me home early, but I told her I had plans with you tonight. She got really angry and started asking questions about where you work now and what you're doing." Phil felt the familiar tightness in his chest. "What kind of questions?" "She wanted to know if you'd introduce me to any new people, if we'd been anywhere unusual, if you'd mentioned anything about Meridian or her job." Lindsay looked up at him with eyes that seemed far too old for her age. "Dad, why is Mom scared of you now?" Phil pulled into a parking spot and turned to face his daughter. For a moment, he considered lying, giving her some comfortable explanation that would protect her from the truth. But Lindsay was too smart for comfortable lies, and the people they were fighting were too dangerous for her to be unprepared. Your mother and I are having a disagreement about business, he said carefully. She thinks I'm going to try to hurt her career, and she's trying to protect herself. Are you? Lindsay asked. Going to hurt her career? Phil looked at his daughter, this brilliant, stubborn, beautiful child who had inherited the best and worst qualities of both her parents, and made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Yes, he said. I am. Lindsay nodded as if she'd expected the answer. Good, she said. She deserves it. That evening, as Phil tucked Lindsay into bed in his apartment, she asked the question he'd been dreading. Dad, when this is over, when you win, what happens to me? Phil sat on the edge of her bed and brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. What do you want to happen? I want to stay with you, she said. I don't want to live with Mom and Mario anymore. They pretend to care about me, but they only pay attention when they need something. Phil felt something break inside his chest. Sweetheart, it might not be that simple. I know, Lindsay said, but you're going to win, aren't you? You're smarter than them, and you're not trying to steal anything. You're just trying to get back what they took. Phil kissed her forehead and turned off the light. As he walked to his study, he realized that Lindsay had just articulated the moral framework that would guide everything he did from that point forward. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about justice. And justice meant that the people who had stolen from him, lied to him, and betrayed him would pay a price that matched their crimes. The war was about to begin in earnest. Chapter 6. The Opening Move. Phil's first strike was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its execution. It began with a single phone call to Clarence Gates, a business journalist at the Wall Street Journal who specialized in exposing corporate corruption. Gates had been investigating Mario's network for 2 years, but had never been able to gather enough evidence to publish. I have something that might interest you, Phil said, sitting in his office at 5 a.m, watching the sun rise over Manhattan. 3 hours later, Gates was sitting across from Phil's desk, staring at documents that represented 2 years of meticulous investigation compressed into actionable intelligence. Jesus Christ, Gates whispered, looking through Alberta's financial analysis of Mario's previous acquisitions. This is a pattern going back 15 years. 17 companies, Phil confirmed. Total estimated theft, $4.7 billion. Gates looked up from the documents. Why are you giving this to me? You could take this to the FBI, the SEC. Because criminal investigations take years, and by the time they act, Meridian will be gone, Phil replied. But a front-page story in the Journal will create immediate pressure for action. What do you want in return? Phil smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. I want you to do your job. Nothing more, nothing less. The story ran 3 days later under the headline, The Corporate Chameleon, How One Man Has Stolen Billions Through Serial Executive Infiltration. It was devastating, comprehensive, and completely accurate. Mario's photograph was on the front page, along with a detailed timeline of his acquisitions and a list of the companies that had been destroyed. Phil read the article over breakfast with Lindsay, who had taken to spending most of her time at his apartment. Valerie had been calling constantly, demanding explanations and making increasingly desperate threats about custody battles and legal action. Dad, Lindsay said, looking up from her cereal, Mom left like 20 voicemails last night. Should I call her back? Not yet, Phil replied. Let her sweat for a while. Phil's phone rang at precisely 8 a.m. Charles McCormick's voice was amused and approving. Nice work, son. The Journal's website crashed from traffic, and Mario's picture is trending on social media. How long do you think it will take them to respond? They're responding now, Phil said, watching the television in his kitchen. CNN was running a breaking news banner. Meridian Industries CEO calls Journal story malicious lies, threatens legal action. On screen, Valerie stood behind a podium in Meridian's conference room, flanked by Mario and a team of lawyers. She looked polished and confident, but Phil could see the tension around her eyes. These allegations are completely without merit, she was saying. Mr. Hunter is a respected business leader with an impeccable track record. This appears to be a vindictive attack by my ex-husband, who was terminated for cause and is attempting to damage the company out of spite. Phil had to admire the strategy. By making it personal, She was trying to discredit the story as the rantings of a bitter ex-husband rather than addressing the substance of the allegations. We will be pursuing all legal remedies against the Wall Street Journal and anyone else involved in spreading these malicious falsehoods, Valerie continued. Meridian Industries has never been stronger, and we will not be deterred by these desperate attempts at character assassination. Phil turned off the television and called Tomas Holcomb. How are they reacting internally? He asked. Panic, Holcomb replied. Our sources inside Meridian say the board is demanding answers. 3 major clients have called emergency meetings, and the stock price is down 12% in pre-market trading. And Mario? Disappeared. His office is empty. His calendar has been cleared, and his secretary says he's taking personal time for health reasons. Phil felt the familiar cold satisfaction of a plan working perfectly. Find him, but don't engage, just watch and report. Phil's second move came that afternoon, when Brader filed a whistleblower complaint with the Securities and Exchange Commission alleging securities fraud, market manipulation, and violation of fiduciary duty. The complaint was supported by 200 pages of evidence and signed affidavits from employees at 3 of Mario's previous companies. The third move was more personal. Phil had Tomas arrange for process servers to deliver divorce papers to Mario Hunter at his Manhattan penthouse, his office at Meridian, and his weekend house in the Hamptons. The papers were filed by Gertrude Bridges, a young lawyer who claimed Mario had promised to marry her and had secretly fathered her 6-month-old child. None of it was true, of course. Gertrude Bridges was an actress paid $10,000 to play a role. The child belonged to her sister, and the DNA evidence had been fabricated. But by the time Mario's lawyers could prove the fraud, the story would be public, his reputation would be destroyed, and Valerie would be forced to choose between her lover and her career. Phil watched the news coverage from his apartment that evening, Lindsay curled up beside him on the couch. The story had taken on a life of its own. Social media was full of memes mocking Mario as a corporate Casanova. Late-night comedians were writing jokes about the Meridian love triangle, and business analysts were questioning whether a company could survive this level of public humiliation. Dad, Lindsay said during a commercial break, are you proud of what you're doing? Phil considered the question carefully. 3 weeks ago, he would have been ashamed of the lies, the manipulation, and the deliberate destruction of people's reputations. But 3 weeks ago, he had still believed that playing fair mattered. I'm proud that I'm fighting back, he said finally. Your mother and Mario thought they could destroy my life and steal everything I worked for, and there would be no consequences. They were wrong. Lindsay nodded thoughtfully. Mom called me today. She was crying. What did she say? She said you'd gone crazy, that you were trying to hurt her because you couldn't handle losing. She asked me to talk to you, to ask you to stop. Phil felt something twist in his chest. Despite everything, part of him still remembered loving Valerie, still remembered the woman he'd thought she was. What did you tell her? Lindsay looked up at him with those green eyes that were so much like her mother's, but somehow completely different. I told her that maybe she should have thought about consequences before she decided to cheat on you. Phil hugged his daughter tighter, wondering when she had become so wise and so cold. He was raising her to be strong, independent, and ruthless when necessary. But he was also raising her to be exactly like him. The thought should have worried him more than it did. Chapter 7. The Counterattack. Mario Hunter's response was swift, brutal, and exactly what Phil had been waiting for. It began with a middle-of-the-night raid on Phil's apartment building by federal agents claiming to investigate terrorist financing and money laundering. The search warrant was broad enough to seize all of Phil's computers, phones, and financial records, effectively paralyzing his operation for 72 hours. The second wave came at dawn, when process servers delivered a restraining order preventing Phil from coming within 500 feet of Lindsay, his ex-wife, or any Meridian Industries property. The order was accompanied by a custody motion claiming Phil had become unstable and potentially dangerous, and was using Lindsay as a weapon in his vendetta against his ex-wife. Phil read the legal documents in the back of Tomas Holcomb's surveillance van, parked 6 blocks from his apartment building while federal agents methodically dismantled his life. Lindsay was staying with Charles McCormick for her own protection, but Phil hadn't been allowed to speak with her since the raid began. It's a good strategy, Brad Orr admitted, reviewing the custody motion on his tablet. They're using the legal system to isolate you from resources and support while discrediting you publicly. If this were anyone else, it would probably work. But it's not anyone else, Phil replied, his voice colder than Holcomb had ever heard it. How long until we can prove the evidence was fabricated? The terrorism angle will collapse within a week, Orr said. The financial records they're claiming show suspicious transactions are all legitimate business expenses, and the supposed connections to overseas terrorist organizations are laughably thin. But the custody battle will take months to resolve, and by then, Meridian will be gone, and Mario will have disappeared with billions in assets, Phil finished. So we accelerate the timeline. Holcomb looked up from his surveillance equipment. Boss, we need to be careful here. Timothy Cowan has been spotted in the city, and our sources suggest he's been given authorization to solve the Phil Powers problem permanently. Phil's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Your daughter is beautiful. Be ashamed if something happened to her. The van fell silent. Phil stared at the message for a long moment, then handed the phone to Holcomb. Trace it, he said quietly. Already on it, Holcomb replied, his fingers flying over his keyboard. It bounced through 6 proxy servers, but there. Sent from a burner phone registered to a fake identity. Purchased with cash at an electronics store in Queens 3 days ago. Phil felt something fundamental shift inside him. The last vestiges of civilized behavior, the final restraints of legal and moral considerations, disappeared like smoke. These people had threatened his daughter. New rules, Phil said. No more playing defense. No more legal maneuvers. No more waiting for investigations or journalists or public opinion. He turned to face his team, and they saw something in his eyes that made them understand why Charles McCormick had chosen him for this war. Tomas, I want to know where Timothy Cowan is every second of every day. When he eats, when he sleeps, when he goes to the bathroom. And I want him to know we're watching. Brad, forget about legal remedies. I want Meridian's financial structure dissected so thoroughly that every transaction, every contract, and every hidden asset is exposed. If they want to play dirty, we'll show them what dirty really looks like. Alberta, trace every dollar that's flowed through Mario's network. Every shell company, every offshore account, every legitimate business that's been used as a front. I want a complete map of their operation. Phil's phone rang. Charles McCormick's voice was tense but controlled. Phil, they just tried to grab Lindsay from school. My security team intercepted them, but it was close. She's safe at the estate now, but we need to discuss next steps. Phil closed his eyes and felt the last of his humanity drain away. I'll be there in an hour. Phil, McCormick said quietly, I want you to understand what you're about to become. Once you cross this line, there's no going back. You'll win, but you'll pay a price that might be higher than you realize. They threatened my daughter, Phil replied. The price is already paid. Phil found Lindsay in McCormick's library, surrounded by security guards and looking smaller than her 11 years. She ran to him when he entered, and he held her tighter than he ever had before. I was scared, Dad, she whispered against his chest. I know, sweetheart, but you're safe now, and you're going to stay safe. What are you going to do to them? Phil looked down at his daughter. This brave, intelligent, beautiful child had become the most important thing in his world and made a promise that would define the rest of his life. I'm going to destroy them, he said. All of them. Completely. Lindsay nodded, as if this was exactly what she'd expected to hear. Good, she said. They deserve it. McCormick entered the library and gestured for Phil to join him by the fireplace. The gloves are off now, the old man said. Are you prepared for what that means? Tell me what you need, Phil replied. McCormick smiled, and it was the expression of a man who had been waiting his entire life for this moment. I need you to remember that Mario Hunter isn't just a corporate raider. He's part of a network that has stolen billions of dollars and destroyed hundreds of lives. And I need you to understand that sometimes justice requires methods that polite society pretends don't exist. Phil nodded. What's the plan? The plan, McCormick said, is to give them exactly what they've given us. Fear, isolation, and the certain knowledge that their world is ending. As if on cue, Phil's phone buzzed with a news alert. The headline made his blood run cold. Meridian Industries CEO found dead in apparent suicide. But it wasn't Valerie who was dead. It was Gustavo Mendoza, Mario's financial backer, found hanging in his Goldman Sachs office with a suicide note confessing to securities fraud and market manipulation. Phil looked at McCormick, who was studying the news report with the expression of a chess master who had just moved his queen into position. "Did you?" Phil began. "I didn't do anything," McCormick replied. "But I may have mentioned to certain interested parties that Mr. Mendoza was cooperating with federal investigators and planning to testify against his associates." Phil understood. Mendoza's death wasn't suicide. It was murder carried out by his own network to prevent him from becoming a liability. And now Mario and Valerie would know that their allies were willing to kill to protect themselves. The war had entered its final phase. Chapter 8, The Reckoning. The death of Gustavo Mendoza sent shockwaves through Mario's network that Phil felt from 50 floors above the chaos. Within hours of the suicide, 2 more of Mario's associates had withdrawn from all business dealings and disappeared, leaving behind carefully worded statements about pursuing other opportunities. Timothy Cowan, the network's cleaner, had vanished entirely, suggesting that even the killers were running from whatever was coming next. Phil watched the collapse from his new command center in McCormick's estate. Surrounded by banks of monitors showing stock prices, news feeds, and surveillance footage from cameras positioned around every property connected to Mario's operation. Lindsay sat beside him, quietly doing homework while absorbing lessons about power, betrayal, and vengeance that would shape her for the rest of her life. "Meridian stock is in free fall," Alberta reported, her fingers dancing across multiple keyboards as she tracked the financial carnage. "Down 68% in 3 days. The board has called an emergency meeting for tomorrow morning." "Mario?" Phil asked. "Still missing," Tomas replied from his position at the surveillance station. "But Valerie's been in crisis meetings for 18 hours straight. Our sources inside the company say she's been making calls to every contact she has, trying to find emergency financing to keep Meridian afloat." Phil's phone buzzed with a text for Valerie. "Please, can we talk?" He showed the message to Lindsay, who looked up from her math homework with those green eyes that had inherited all of her mother's intelligence and none of her weakness. "What do you think I should do?" he asked his daughter. Lindsay considered the question with the seriousness of someone much older. Mom never said please to anyone unless she was desperate. She must be really scared now. "Are you ready to see her?" Lindsay nodded. "I want to hear what she has to say." Phil typed back, "McCormick Estate. 1 hour. Come alone." Valerie arrived exactly on time, driving a rental car and looking like she hadn't slept in days. Her usually perfect hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail. Her makeup couldn't quite hide the dark circles under her eyes, and her hands shook slightly as she walked up the steps to McCormick's front door. Phil met her in the same library where he'd first learned the scope of what he was fighting against. Lindsay sat in a corner chair, a silent witness to the conversation that would determine all of their futures. "You look terrible," Phil said, not unkindly. Valerie managed a bitter laugh. "I've had better weeks." She looked around the opulent library, taking in the leather-bound books, expensive artwork, and understated displays of wealth. "I should have known Charles was more than he seemed." "You should have known a lot of things," Phil replied. "Like what would happen when you betrayed someone who actually loved you." Valerie's composure cracked slightly. "Phil, I know you hate me. I know I destroyed our marriage and hurt you in ways that can't be forgiven. But Lindsay is innocent in all of this. She doesn't deserve to have a mother who uses her as a prop in corporate warfare," Phil interrupted. "She doesn't deserve to have her life threatened because her mother chose to get involved with criminals." "Mario isn't a criminal," Valerie said automatically, then stopped. "Or at least, I didn't know." "You knew exactly what he was," Phil said. "You just didn't care because you thought you could control him." She reached into her purse and pulled out a set of legal documents. "Resignation letters. Mine and Mario's. We'll step down from Meridian, turn over all corporate assets, and disappear. In exchange, you call off whatever you've unleashed." Phil took the documents and read them carefully. They were comprehensive: admissions of misconduct, agreements to forfeit all compensation and benefits, and legal releases that would make it impossible for either of them to claim wrongful termination or pursue any kind of legal action against the company. "Where's Mario now?" Phil asked. "Safe," Valerie replied, "but scared. People he trusted are dead. His financial backing has evaporated, and he knows you have enough evidence to destroy him completely. Why should I accept this deal? I have you completely beaten." Valerie met his eyes, and for a moment, Phil saw a flash of the sharp intelligence that had first attracted him to her. Because victory isn't the same as vengeance, and vengeance isn't the same as justice. You've already won. Meridian is safe, Mario's network is destroyed, and we'll never be able to threaten you again. The question is whether you want justice or if you want to watch us burn. Phil looked over at Lindsay, who was watching the conversation with an expression he couldn't quite read. "What do you think, sweetheart?" Lindsay stood up and walked over to her mother. For a moment, Valerie's face lit up with hope. Perhaps her daughter would forgive her. Perhaps there was still a chance for some kind of relationship. Instead, Lindsay looked her mother straight in the eye and said, "I think you should have thought about consequences before you decided to betray people who loved you." Then she turned and walked out of the library, leaving her parents alone with the wreckage of their marriage and their family. Phil signed the resignation letters and handed them back to Valerie. "You have 24 hours to clear out your offices and transfer all corporate assets back to the company. After that, if I ever see either of you again, the deal is off." Valerie nodded and stood to leave. At the door, she turned back one last time. "Phil, I know you'll never forgive me, but I hope someday you can help Lindsay understand that I did love her, even if I didn't know how to show it." "She understands perfectly," Phil replied. "That's the problem." After Valerie left, Phil found Lindsay sitting by the estate's lake, throwing stones into the water with mechanical precision. He sat beside her on the wooden dock and watched the ripples spread across the calm surface. "Are you okay?" he asked. "I'm fine," Lindsay replied, not looking at him. "I just want to know if it's over." "It's over," Phil confirmed. "We won." Lindsay threw another stone, harder this time. "Then why don't I feel better?" Phil put his arm around his daughter and pulled her close. "Because winning isn't the same as being happy, and justice isn't the same as satisfaction." They sat in silence for a while, watching the sun set over the water. Finally, Lindsay spoke again. "Dad, are you proud of who you've become?" It was the same question she had asked weeks earlier, but now it carried a weight that made Phil's chest tight. He had become someone who could orchestrate the destruction of human lives with surgical precision. He had become someone who could make life-and-death decisions without hesitation. He had become someone his enemies feared and his allies respected, but he was no longer someone he entirely recognized. "I'm proud that I protected you," he said finally. "I'm proud that I didn't let them steal everything we worked for. And I'm proud that when it mattered most, I was strong enough to do what was necessary." Lindsay nodded thoughtfully. "Good," she said, "because I want to be just like you when I grow up." The words should have filled Phil with joy. Instead, they filled him with a kind of terror he'd never experienced before. He was raising his daughter to be strong, intelligent, and ruthless, but he was also raising her to be someone who could destroy lives without hesitation when she felt betrayed. As they walked back to the house, Phil realized that his victory over Mario and Valerie had come at a cost he was only beginning to understand. He had saved his daughter from their corruption, but he had also shown her that love could be conditional, that loyalty had to be earned, and that betrayal demanded punishment. Lindsay Powers was 11 years old, and she had already learned lessons about power and vengeance that most people never learned at all. The war was over, but Phil suspected the consequences were just beginning. Chapter 9. The Price of Victory. 6 months after Valerie and Mario's resignations, Phil stood in the corner office that had once belonged to his ex-wife, looking out over the city that had witnessed his fall and resurrection. As CEO of Meridian Industries, he commanded resources and respect that exceeded even his previous position, but the view from the top was colder than he had expected. The company had not only survived Mario's attempted theft, but had thrived under Phil's leadership. Stock prices had recovered to record highs, new contracts had been secured across 3 continents, and the board of directors treated Phil with a deference that bordered on reverence. He had become exactly what Charles McCormick had predicted, a corporate emperor whose word was law and whose enemies disappeared before they could become threats. But empires, Phil had learned, were lonely places. Lindsay, now 12, had grown into a formidable young woman who combined her mother's calculating intelligence with her father's ruthless pragmatism. She spent her afternoons in Phil's office, quietly observing board meetings and strategy sessions while doing homework that was years ahead of her grade level. The other executives had learned to speak carefully when she was present. The child had an uncanny ability to remember inconvenient statements and use them against people who underestimated her. "Dad," Lindsay said, looking up from her laptop where she had been analyzing Meridian's quarterly projections, "I found something interesting in the Patterson Industries acquisition files." Phil turned from the window to look at his daughter. At 12, she was already showing signs of becoming a beautiful woman, but her eyes held a hardness that troubled him more than he cared to admit. "What did you find?" Lindsay turned her screen so he could see the financial spreadsheet she had created. 3 of their board members have been receiving payments from shell companies connected to Mario's old network. "I think they're trying to rebuild their operation using Patterson as a base." Phil studied the data, impressed despite himself by Lindsay's thoroughness. She had identified patterns that his own financial analyst had missed, connecting transactions across multiple jurisdictions to reveal a conspiracy that could threaten Meridian's market position. "What do you recommend?" he asked. Lindsay's smile was sharp and calculating. "We acquire Patterson before they can consolidate control, fire the board members who can't be trusted, and prosecute them for securities fraud. It sent a message to anyone else who might think Mario's methods can be revived." Phil felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. His 12-year-old daughter was casually recommending the destruction of people's lives and careers with the same tone most children use to discuss television shows. "Lindsay," he said carefully, "do you ever think about what happens to the people we remove from positions of power?" She looked at him with genuine confusion. "They face the consequences of their choices." "Why?" "Because they're human beings with families, mortgages, and problems that have nothing to do with their business decisions." Lindsay's expression didn't change. "So were we, but that didn't stop Mom and Mario from trying to destroy us. Why should we show them mercy they wouldn't have shown us?" Phil sat down behind his desk and studied his daughter's face. When had she become so cold? When had compassion become a weakness in her worldview? "Because," he said slowly, "mercy is what separates us from them." Lindsay closed her laptop and looked at her father with disappointment that cut deeper than any criticism. "Dad, mercy is what weak people use to justify letting strong people win. You taught me that." Phil's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. He glanced at it and felt his blood freeze. "Your daughter has learned well. She'll make an excellent successor. MH. Mario Hunter was supposed to be dead. Tomas Holcomb had confirmed it 6 months ago. A car accident in Thailand. Body burned beyond recognition. Dental records confirming the identity. But the man who had orchestrated 17 corporate thefts was apparently still alive and still watching." Phil showed the message to Lindsay, who read it without any visible emotion. "He's not dead," she said matter-of-factly. "How long have you known?" 3 months. I've been tracking financial movements that match his old patterns. He's been rebuilding his network using offshore accounts and cryptocurrency transfers." Phil stared at his daughter in shock. "Why didn't you tell me?" Lindsay's green eyes met his without flinching. "Because I wanted to see if you were still strong enough to handle it, or if success had made you soft." The words hit Phil like a physical blow. His 12-year-old daughter had been testing him, evaluating his worthiness, deciding whether he deserved her loyalty. When had their relationship become a power struggle? "And what's your assessment?" he asked quietly. Lindsay stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city with the confidence of someone who expected to own it someday. "I think you've forgotten that the war never really ends. There are always new enemies, new threats, new people who think they can take what we've built." She turned back to face him, and Phil saw something in her expression that terrified him more than any threat Mario could make. "But don't worry, Dad. I haven't forgotten. And when you're ready to retire, I'll be ready to take over. Phil's intercom buzzed. His secretary's voice was tense. Mr. Powers, there's a call for Lindsay on line 3. The caller says it's her mother. Lindsay walked to Phil's desk and picked up the phone. Hello, Mom? She said, her voice suddenly younger and more innocent. Phil could hear Valerie's voice through the speakerphone, desperate and pleading. Lindsay, sweetheart, I need to warn you. Mario is still alive. Lindsay interrupted. I know. I've been tracking him for months. The line went silent. Finally, Valerie spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. What have you become? Lindsay's mask of innocence dropped completely. I've become what you taught me to become, Mom. I've become someone who wins. Lindsay, please. You're 12 years old. You should be worried about school and friends, and I should be worried about protecting everything Dad built from people who want to steal it, Lindsay said coldly. The way he protected us from you. Valerie was crying now. I know I made mistakes, but I never wanted this for you. I never wanted you to become strong. Lindsay finished. Intelligent? Capable of protecting myself and the people I care about? You're right, Mom. You never wanted any of those things for me. Lindsay hung up the phone and looked at her father with satisfaction. She's calling to warn us about Mario because she's scared of what he might do to her. She still thinks she can manipulate us through guilt and sentiment. Phil felt like he was looking at a stranger. Lindsay, that was cruel. It was honest, she replied. She chose Mario over us, chose ambition over family, chose betrayal over loyalty. Why should I pretend to care about her feelings now? Phil's phone rang. Charles McCormick's voice was urgent. Phil, we have a problem. Mario Hunter is very much alive, and he's been building a new network specifically designed to target Meridian. More importantly, he's been feeding information to Lindsay for months. Phil looked at his daughter, who was watching him with those calculating green eyes. What information? Financial data, strategic plans, personnel files. He's been grooming her, Phil, preparing her to be his inside agent when she's old enough to be useful. Lindsay smiled at her father, and for the first time since the war began, Phil felt genuine fear. Not for himself, but for what his daughter was becoming. Dad, Lindsay said sweetly, we need to talk. As Phil hung up the phone and faced his 12-year-old daughter across his executive desk, he realized that his victory over Mario and Valerie had come at a price he was only now beginning to understand. He had saved Meridian Industries, secured his position, and eliminated his enemies. But in the process, he had created something that might be far more dangerous than anything he had fought against. He had created a successor who had learned all of his lessons about power, loyalty, and revenge, but none of his lessons about mercy, compassion, or forgiveness. Lindsay Powers was 12 years old, and she was already more ruthless than her father had ever been. The war was over, but Phil suspected that an even more dangerous conflict was about to begin. The question was whether this time, he would be the hunter or the prey. As father and daughter stared at each other across the desk, both calculating their next move, Phil realized that the auction that had started this war had been exactly what Valerie claimed, an auction of loyalty. But the highest bidder hadn't been Charles McCormick or even Phil himself. The highest bidder had been the future, and it had just claimed his daughter as its prize. The game was far from over. It was just beginning. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your precious time. If you enjoyed this story, then please make sure you subscribe to this channel. That would help me a lot. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.